So we're going to spend a few minutes today talking about pre-washing, the never-ending question of should I pre-wash or not. I will say those who pre-wash because at one point they didn't and had a problem. That would be the school I'm in. I didn't pre-wash, never had a problem, and then I did, and now I always pre-wash.
I choose to live on the edge.
And that's an option too. I would say probably half to 3/4 do not pre-wash, about 25% religiously pre-wash. I like to pre-wash because you can have issues, but it is not convenient. A lot of times we're here at the store and starting a project and don't have the luxury of being able to pre-wash first. Before you give a quilt, you should always wash it. If you don't wash it before you gift it, be sure to give them instructions, because there's many a story we've heard where my friend, my cousin, my whoever gave me a quilt, I washed it and I ruined it, and I'm afraid to tell her. And you've given that gift and you never see it again, and you assume they didn't like it when actually they feel horrible because they ruined it. So you have to include washing instructions with your quilts if you haven't pre-washed it already. I'm going to talk about pre-washing fabric first for a few minutes, and then talk about quilts. When you pre-wash, I've got fat quarters here. A fat quarter is a pre-cut, which makes me think you do not pre-wash 5-inch squares. You do not pre-wash 2.5-inch strips. You will end up with a knotted mess. But you can pre-wash fat quarters. One of the hassles of pre-washing is, this is a piece of fabric that I just tore to show you. All of these start to pull off when you pre-wash, and they end up knotting up and making a big old wad and a mess in your washer. That's because of the way the fabric is made. The fabric is woven across, and so all of those will keep coming off in as you, oh, and there's the phone, just to make it feel like a daily dose. All of these will keep coming off, and they'll pull and make a mess out of your fabric. The way to stop that is, on your fabric, just take a small snip. I'm not talking a big chunk, but just a small snip off of each corner. Hopefully you can see that. It's not a really big snip, but just a little bit on each angle on all 4 corners. And this is on yardage or fat quarters I do this. You don't want to take off too much that you lose some of your usable fabric, but just a small snip. What that does is, as those strings start to unwind, they'll come off the end and they'll just come off. They won't stay back and forth and all wadded up, so your fabric will come out much nicer. The other thing is, whenever I pre-wash, when I do these snips, I do it in my laundry room by my washer. Anything that I'm going to pre-wash, I snip, I throw it in the wash, and then I bring it out. What that does is, if there's something in my sewing room that has corners snipped, I know it's pre-washed. If the corners are not snipped, I know it hasn't been pre-washed. The reason that I cut all 4 corners is I might work on a project and only use half of the fat quarter. The other half, I still have 2 snipped corners, so I can still tell in my stash what's been pre-washed and what hasn't. When you're working on a project, you want to be consistent. You want to have all the fabric pre-washed or none of the fabric pre-washed. So that's a little note on pre-washing. There are a couple things that you want to be sure that you do as well. If you are using fabric from different sources, you've got maybe big box store fabric, sorry about that. You've got fabric from us, you've got fabric from other quilt stores, you've got fabric that was gifted to you that you don't know where it came from. They all have different qualities of fabric at all of the different stores. Independent quilt shop quality will all be great quality, very similar across the board. But if you're getting things at other places and you don't know, the thread count will be different, so they will shrink and they will wear differently. If you've ever seen an old vintage quilt, and some of it is in great shape, and you'll notice, oh, that red fabric, every place they use that red, it was shredded. That fabric wasn't the same quality as the other pieces around it. So you want to pre-wash everything and be sure that if it is one's going to shrink way more than the other, you want to be sure it shrinks before you put it into your quilt, or your quilt is going to have chunks of shrinkage where that fabric is. So that's a little bit on pre-washing. There are some products available to make pre-washing better, and they can also, some of them can also be used after your quilt is done. There is a product called Retain and a product called Synthropol. These are, spin it
There
so
you
you
go.
can see the label. Thank you, Cheryl. Retain will help stop fabric from bleeding. Synthropol will help set dye. Typically you're using this on a batik type fabric. The directions are on the bottles on how to use it. There's usually a soak or put it in the washer with it. But this will keep the dyes from running. This will actually set the dye into the fabric more. They are both available here. Some people swear by them, some people never use them. It depends on what you like and what you get used to, what type of fabric you use. Another product is called Restoration. When I mentioned a vintage quilt, this is made as a way to restore, hence the name Restoration, restore vintage quilts. A lot of them will have that kind of brownish tone to them. This will help. You actually put this in a tub of water and you soak your quilt in it. This will help restore vintage quilts. The other product, I don't have any with me. We don't sell it. Our vendors don't supply it. There are two products that you can get at any of the grocery stores. They're in the laundry aisle. They come in a box. They look like dryer sheets, but they actually go in the water. One is called Color Catcher by Clorox. The other is Dye Magnet, and I forget who that one's by. Sorry, one is Clorox, can't remember. But Color Catcher and Dye Magnet, they look like a dryer sheet. You throw it in the washer. When you pre-wash your fabric, it soaks up all the excess dye. I also strongly recommend them if you're teaching your kids to help you with the laundry. Have them throw one in the washing machine. You can wash blue jeans with a white t-shirt and it soaks up the blue dye and your whites stay white. Those are a great product. If you have not pre-washed and you've sewn a quilt of many colors, you go to wash that quilt and some of the color runs. If you put a Color Catcher or a Dye Magnet into the washer with your project, it will soak up the excess dye and it won't ruin your quilt. So when I talked about giving a quilt as a gift, give it with washing instructions. I will either take a box or a few sheets of one of those products and give it with the quilt. Stick a couple sheets in an envelope and say, when you wash the quilt, be sure to put these in the washing machine with the quilt, and it will keep the dye from running on your quilt. A lot of people tend to say, oh, it's just beautiful, I don't want to wash it because it'll change the way the quilt is. Especially if you're giving baby quilts, you really, really should wash those quilts. That fabric has traveled around the world to get here. It's made with different dyes in the process. You want that to be squeaky clean and really nice for that new baby that's getting that quilt. So I really recommend washing your projects before you give them to somebody.